there! Welcome to Skeleton Key Production. I'm Crown Gray's Kokon. Let's get into the video. Today's video we're going to be continuing with our Disney series within our film reviews playlist, and in today's video we're looking at none other than Alice in Wonderland from 1951. So as always we're going to go through 6 different sections. We're going to have the story of the story, the story of the creator, the story of the studio, the themes and the history, the legacy, and any notable lines or notable effects within the film. But before we do all that, don't forget obviously to hit the like button, subscribe if you haven't already, and obviously hit the bell button so that you stay notified for any upcoming videos that we have. So without further ado, we're going to dive straight now into the story of the story. So of course the story of Alice in Wonderland goes all the way back to Lewis Carroll when he wrote Alice's Adventures in Wonderland in 1865 and Through the Looking Glass in 1871. So by and large, Disney stuck a lot with what the original storyline was for this. So without further ado, we're going to dive straight into the plot of Alice in Wonderland. So the film starts with Alice and her tutor. They're out in a field, and the tutor is telling a history lesson in a really boring way. And Alice is kind of, off daydreaming. So she's there with her cat Dinah, and she ends up talking to the cat and talking about how if she had her way, she would live in a world full of opposites where you have talking cats and where you have like talking flowers and all the rest of it, right? So she sings a little song there, and at the end of this song, this is where she comes across the White Rabbit. So she sees the White Rabbit, he's in a waistcoat and he's got a pocket watch, right? And he's said that he's awfully late for something. And this tweaks her curiosity, because what could a rabbit possibly be late for? So while the rabbit goes off and he goes down the rabbit hole, she of course follows him, and this is where that phrase comes from, going down the rabbit hole. And she floats down through a kind of like chasm, and when she gets to the bottom of that chasm, she ends up following him through some very strange corridors. And at the end of one of the corridors, in one of these strange rooms, there is a talking doorknob. And the talking doorknob says, right, you're much too big to come through, you need to shrink yourself down. So this is when she ends up drinking from a glass vial, which says, drink me. She shrinks down, but now the problem is that while she's small enough to fit through the door, the key has been left on the table. So this is where a box appears, and it has like cookies in it or some sort of biscuits, and it says, eat me. So then she eats it and then ends up becoming far too large. And of course the doorknob kind of is laughing, but she's very sad, and she ends up crying. And her tears end up flooding the entire room. So when she ends up drinking the glass vial again, this is where she ends up shrinking down into a glass vial, and through all the tears that she's cried, she ends up going through the hole in the doorknob and comes out the other side. So when she comes out the other side, there is a dodo and there's many other animals out on the high seas, and this is where they start to do a so-called caucus race, right? So the dodo is on a rock, and the rest of them are running about in circles trying to dry off. But of course, they're not going to dry off because the waves keep on hitting them. And Alice kind of points this out, but the dodo doesn't seem to see it. So what ends up happening is then she sees the White Rabbit again. She then follows the White Rabbit, and the White Rabbit leads her to Tweedledee and Tweedledum. So Tweedledee and Tweedledum, they're there in the forest, and they proceed to tell her a story. And the story that they tell her is that of the walrus and the carpenter, otherwise known as the story of the curious oysters. And I think that the walrus in this very much is very reminiscent of Honest John character in Pinocchio. More likely not at the same artists and stuff, but we'll talk about that a little bit later. So anyway, so the walrus ends up going into the sea, and he basically convinces the oysters to come on a little journey with him. And he goes on a little journey. The carpenter has built this kind of restaurant, and it's there that they proceed to go and have a feast. And the oysters are of course on the menu. But the walrus ends up eating all the oysters, and this obviously leaves the carpenter to be very mad and chases the walrus out of the restaurant. So after hearing this story, Alice is like, right, thank you, that was a great story, I don't want to hear any more, and then she goes off onto the next bit. So she then goes to the house of the White Rabbit, and for some reason the rabbit calls her Marianne. I don't know if that's a servant, I don't know if it's his wife, whoever that is meant to be. Anyway, he goes and orders her to go inside the house to fetch his gloves. And for some reason, I don't know why she does this, but she goes in and she decides that she wants to take a bite, right, from something that she eats. But I don't know why you do this, because obviously you know that eating and drinking this place has all sorts of ramifications. But anyway, she does this anyway. So she eats this and ends up becoming massive, right? She ends up like taking up the whole house, and she ends up being stuck. So the white rabbit then asks the dodo for help. The dodo then asks a lizard with a ladder for help, and the lizard for the ladder is put down the chimney to try and get Alice out. But all the soot that has been kicked up makes Alice sneeze, and this propels the lizard up into the air. So the dodo has the smart idea that he's going to set fire to the rabbit's house and burn the monster out, right? Or smoke the monster out, rather. So Alice at this point goes, right, okay, I need to get back to normal size. So she reaches down into the garden, picks up a carrot and eats it. And for some reason in the story, even though eating up to this point has made people bigger rather than smaller, she eats it and she shrinks back down to normal size instead of becoming an even bigger like giant than she really was. But anyway, so she goes back to normal size, and they end up just leaving the dodo trying to like set fire to this house. So for the next bit, Alice is in a garden, and this is where she sees bread and butterflies. She sees rocking horse flies. She sees talking flowers, and this is where they have the lovely song, which is Golden Afternoon. And when they finish singing the song, they scare Alice away because they think that she's a weed, right? So they try and get her out of the garden. So after they kicked her out of the garden, this is where she comes across the talking caterpillar, who sat on a mushroom stool smoking shisha. And as he's talking and reciting poetry, there ends up being letters and other little patterns that come out in the smoke. However, he ends up getting really annoyed when she makes a joke about his height, or kind of makes a reference, kind of like talking about she doesn't want to be the height that she is. So he gets really triggered, and then he turns into a butterfly. And just before he flaps off, he tells her that one side of the mushroom that he sat on will make her bigger, and the other will make her small. And we'll talk about that a little bit later and stuff, But anyway, so she kind of bears that in mind, so if she tries to take like one bite, ends up becoming too big, takes another bite, ends up becoming too small. So then she has like a lick of the mushroom, and then she ends up becoming back to normal size. So this is where she comes across the Cheshire Cat, right? So the Cheshire Cat, he's a little bit mad, a little bit crazy, right? And he just does an insane amount of trolling, just talks absolute nonsense, right? And he says that in order for her to get back home, she will need to speak to the Queen. And the way to get to the Queen is first of all going to the Mad Hatter's tea party. So at this tea party, you have the Mad Hatter, you have the March Hare, you have the Dormouse, and what they're doing is they're celebrating a very happy unbirthday. Now, what is an unbirthday, you ask? That is when every other day that's not your birthday is a happy unbirthday, right? So that's what they're celebrating. It's it seems to be a cause for celebration. So anyway, they do all this, and ends up all kinds of craziness ends up happening at this tea party. But in the midst of this, the white rabbit shows up, and obviously he's in a rush, like he's insisting that he's late. But they go and get his pocket watch. And for some reason, they decide to fill it full of jam. They decide to fill it full of butter, all kinds of nonsense, right? And they end up smashing it. So now, obviously, the rabbit's annoyed, and he ends up going off into the woods. And this is where Alice ends up following him. So this is now Tugly Wood. And in Tugly Wood, there's all sorts of weird birds doing all sorts of like very strange things. But it's starting to get dark. And Alice, in turn, is starting to get sad because she's been out here for, it's been nice, but at the end of the day, she wants to get back home, right? And so she ends up getting very, very sad. And this is where she ends up crying and ends up singing a very good advice. This is that song. So we'll talk about that a little bit later in terms of why she ends up singing that song. But once she's finished singing the song, this is where the Cheshire Cat returns again and leads the way to the Queen's castle through a tree stump. So when Alice reaches the castle, this is where you have the cards, who are guards. They end up painting the roses red. So the reason why they're painting the roses red is because they planted some white roses, and obviously the Queen wants red ones. So they paint it red. However, the Queen ends up coming, and she goes, "Off with their heads!" So the Queen obviously has serious anger issues, and yet she goes and speaks to Alice and says, "Would you like to play some croquet?" And of course, as with everything in Wonderland, it's not a normal croquet match. There's flamingos as the kind of whatever they call it in croquet. I've never really played croquet. Anyway, whatever. They have flamingos and they have hedgehogs, right? So of course, for everyone in the kingdom, nobody wants to annoy the Queen. So they rig it so that anytime she ends up playing, she ends up winning, and anyone who she plays against ends up losing. So While this is going on, the Cheshire Cat reappears. He makes a bit of a comeback, and he decides that he's going to troll the Queen. And Alice ends up getting blamed for this, and of course it's off with her head. But the king, who's a little bit of a beta male, he kind of like comes in and says, "Oh, couldn't we have a trial? Like please, can we have a trial?" So she goes, "Okay, fine, we'll have a trial then." So it ends up being a trial, and this is like a really ridiculous show trial. And the people that they get as witnesses are the Mad Hatter, the March Hare, and the Dormouse, who all proceed to speak complete nonsense, and for some reason this is taken seriously. So Alice, in the midst of all this, goes, "Right, okay." She's still got the mushroom in her pocket, so she takes a bite out of it and becomes absolutely massive. And this is where she gives the Queen a piece of her mind. But as she's talking, she ends up shrinking back down to her regular size. And this is where the Queen ends up getting really mad and chases her all throughout Wonderland. So as she's gone all the way back through Wonderland, yeah, she's now reached the talking doorknob once again. And she can't get through, and they're really quickly approaching, and she really panics and stuff. She's like, "Oh my God, how am I going to escape?" And then she wakes up and she realizes that everything that she dreamed in Wonderland was all just a dream. And yeah, she goes back to living normal life. And this is how the film ends. And she goes off and lives, well, I suppose happy ever after. But I think after the dream like that, you'd be quite disturbed. But anyway, so that explains the story of the story. So now we have to talk about the story of the creative process that went into the making of Alice in Wonderland. So of course the story was created originally by Lewis Carroll. So that was actually his pen name. His actual name was Charles Lutheridge Dodson. So he was an author, a poet, and a mathematician. And it's likely that he named the story of Alice in Wonderland after a certain Alice Liddell. Now, Alice Liddell is a very small girl, and we'll talk about this in a little bit more depth here. But the thing is, it's Lewis had a bit of an obsession with young girls, in particular taking pictures of very young girls. And so one day he was very close to like the Liddell family, and they went out on a picnic, and Alice kind of insisted on him retelling a story which he told to her many times before, right? So on this picnic, this is where at the end of the story she convinces him to actually write down the story. So many months later, he kind of like drags his feet, but many months later, he finally gets around to actually writing the story. And so this was in 1862 where this little picnic happened, right? In 1863, Lewis Carroll and the Liddell family kind of drift apart. And the Liddell family don't actually give a reason for why they drifted apart. And it's a thing where Lewis Carroll kind of then went on to deny that Alice was based on any sort of girl. There's there's no Alice. It's not based off anyone at all. But more likely than not, what it was that at age 11, he proposes to her. So we'll talk about that a little bit later and stuff, right? But that's probably why the family and him kind of like drifted apart. But anyway, in spite of the kind of very dark history regarding all of that, the story of Alice's Adventures in Wonderland and the sequel Through the Looking Glass were very, very successful. And so, of course, Walt Disney, when he was growing up, he was very much influenced by the different stories. And so from a very young age, he wanted to make films about this, right? But in terms of the creative process that went into this, it's a thing where what he wanted to do was to keep the story as close to the original as possible, because a lot of the kind of humor, a lot of the kind of gags already within the thing. So there's no need for writers to kind of like add extra little jokes in, because like the whole story is quite humorous in and of itself. So while there weren't any add-ins, there were actually some omissions. So the reason for that obviously is for pacing purposes. And this is because Walt Disney wanted to make something which would be accessible for children, and he didn't want it to go on for far, far too long. So he cut out a lot of stories. So for instance, the stories that he cut out were that of the Jabberwock, the story of the Duchess, the story of the Mock Turtle, the Griffin, and also the White Knight. Now, what's interesting about the White Knight is that within the original script for this, the White Knight was going to be modelled off of Walt Disney himself. And it was decided for once, rare time in Walt Disney life, he decided that the female character was actually going to be genuinely empowered, right? So, as we said in other videos as well, like when we talk about Cinderella, for instance, she ends up having ex machinas from other things, right? But in this, it's decided that instead of a White Knight coming to save her, that she would figure it out by herself. And this is where the song Very Good Advice comes from, right? So instead of there being a white knight to save her, this is where she kind of goes and figures it out for herself. So that explains kind of the story of the kind of like creative process that went into it. But now we have to talk about the story of the studio. So Alice in Wonderland for Disney end up kind of being a bit of a cursed film. Now what I mean by that is all the way back in 1923 when he was doing Laughograms, he made Alice in Wonderland. So we spoke about this in previous videos before. So yeah, so he made that then. And the problem was that Laughograms ended up going bankrupt in 1923. So the film ended up being finished, but it never actually got released to the general public. So he was convinced that he was going to make the film in 1933. However, he got put off because Paramount at that time wanted to do a live action version of it, right? So the film ended up being scrapped for a while up until 1936, where he decided he was going to have a Mickey Mouse do this. You know, so this is like a little 8-minute cartoon, and it's Mickey Mouse basically kind of doing like the story of Alice in Wonderland. And then in 1938, based on the success of Snow White, which obviously came out the year before, Disney now had a lot of money, right? And so what he did with some of that money is he went and bought up the rights for Alice in Wonderland. And so in 1939, he got David Hall to do the storyboard, and he got Al Perkins to do the story reel. I may have got the two things confused, but Al Perkins is the writer and David Hall is the illustrator, right? He's the animator. So the problem with the one that they were working on in 1939 is that Disney didn't really like David Hall's illustrations because it looked far too much like the original illustrations within the books. And on top of that, with regard to Al Perkins, he found that the storyline was just a bit too dark. So work on this kind of got paused for a little bit. And as we've said in our other videos as well, the early 1940s had a lot of issues for Disney. We won't go into it now. Check out our other videos. We spoke about it ad nauseum. So just check those other videos out if you want more like a juicy gossip about all the things that's going on. But anyway, after World War II, Disney hired Aldous Huxley, as this is the author of A Brave New World. He got him to rewrite the script. However, what he found with Huxley's version was that it stuck far too close to the original, and so this ended up being changed again. And also another thing that ended up being changed is the fact that, you know, originally they wanted it to be a live action film, and this is actually going to have Luana Patton, who was in A Song of the South, and it was also going to have Lisa Davis, who would later be in 101 Dalmatians. So they wanted it to be live action. However, Disney kind of realized that in order for the film to be made and to do it real justice to the actual story, the whole thing would have to be animated. So this is where they made a shift from it being a focus on live action to it being a shift focusing on animation. Now, like we said for the Pinocchio video, all the way back in 1940, you can see in the opening scene for that, you see that the Disney studios were working on ideas for Peter Pan and for Alice in Wonderland. So fast forward now to 1948, and this is where, like we said in the last video, there was a race on between Cinderella, Alice in Wonderland and Peter Pan. So Cinderella ended up winning in that race, Alice in Wonderland came second, and Peter Pan came third. However, in 1949, you end up having an Anglo-French film of Alice in Wonderland, and this was going to be with stop-motion puppets who were going to be animated. And Disney used his power and his influence to basically do a bit of protectionism. So what he did is he sued the film to make sure that it couldn't be shown in American cinemas, right? So this obviously gave him an unfair advantage, and that, you know, they knew that they were working on Alice in Wonderland stuff, right? So before it even came out, they kind of disadvantaged this Anglo-French film, yeah. So yeah, there's a bit of like shadiness, but anyway. So that kind of talks about the story of the studio, and now we're going to talk about the casting that they had for the film. So with regards to the casting for this, there end up being a lot of people. We don't have time to go into every single person, but we will kind of run through a bit of a list now. So in terms of the voice of Alice, this is Catherine Beaumont, and she would later be in Peter Pan. You had Ed Wynn, and he was the voice of the Mad Hatter, and who would later be in Mary Poppins. This is the voice of Uncle Albert. For the Caterpillar, you had Richard Haydn, and he would later be in The Sound of Music. For Sterling Holloway, who plays the Cheshire Cat, and for Verna Felton, who plays the Queen of Hearts. Both of them we've covered in more detail with regard to the Dumbo video. Definitely check that out for more of a kind of list of like what all the films that they were both in. And then you have Pat O'Malley, who's the voice of Tweedledee and Tweedledum. He's in 101 Dalmatians, he's in Mary Poppins, he's in Jungle Book, and he's also in Robin Hood. You had Bill Thompson, who's the voice of the White Rabbit. So he's in Peter Pan, Lady and the Tramp, Sleeping Beauty, Aristocats, and also he is the voice of Droopy. So when you hear the voice of Droopy, that is actually the voice of the White Rabbit in Alice in Wonderland. Then also as well, like we said in the last video talking about Cinderella, you had Jimmy MacDonald, who plays the Dormouse, and you had Lucille Bliss, who plays the Daisies and the Tulips, and both of these were in Cinderella and other things as well. But check those two videos out for more kind of details on what they did. So, of course, they had many more people within the cast than this, but these are just an idea of the main ones, right? So that kind of concludes the story of the studio, and now we're going to talk about the themes and the history. So talking about the themes and the history, some people have kind of overanalyzed Alice in Wonderland, yeah. You know, you tend to get this a lot with kind of like English literature students and with like English teachers and stuff, people reading all kinds of weird meanings into things, the kind of symbolism within it. They, you know, you're doing too much, right? Just chill, yeah. You're thinking far too deeply about it. It doesn't represent all these. It's just nonsense, right? What it is meant to just be nonsense. It's meant to be full of puns. It's meant to be kind of just silliness, right? That's the whole point of why he made it. And it wasn't influenced by drugs. There's no evidence that it was influenced by drugs. Lewis Carroll, he may have taken some sort of opiate, but it wouldn't cause you to have trips like this. LSD hadn't been invented till the 60s. More likely than not, there's no evidence that he took any magic mushrooms. So it's not influenced by drugs. We'll talk about that a little bit later. But you know, the association with drugs comes almost a century later with the hippie movement. We'll talk about that in more depth. What it's actually about, and you know, there's nothing to see here. What it's actually about is just the story of a 30-year-old man trying to win the affections of a 10/11-year-old. So nothing to see here. Oh my god, it's so weird. But the point is that when we look at like the themes and the history, we obviously, like we said before, everything is it's a moment of history. Yeah, like kind of it's a piece of history, right? So when you look at a book, when you look at a film, it's a part of a historic process. So Lewis Carroll, rather than the Liddell family calling the police on him, they kind of just stopped him from seeing Alice Liddell. And the reason for that is because in England at the time, the age of consent was just 12 years old. And it would stay that way all the way until 1875. So from 1275 all the way till 1875, age consent in England was 12. And in 1875, they raised it to the ripe old age of 13. Yeah, 13. And it wasn't until 1885 that it became 16. And actually, just as a bit of trivia, in 1917, so during the war, there was talk of them raising it from 16 to 17, and it lost in the Commons by just one vote. But that's just a bit of trivia. But it gives you an idea of the reason why no one called the police on him, as would happen nowadays if a 30-year-old tried to propose to an 11-year-old. That's because of that. So the whole reason why he wrote the story, the whole reason why he made the story up, was to impress Alice Liddell. So yeah, so it's, you know, parking the very kind of dark origins of the story, it still had quite a great legacy, right? Although the legacy of this film was very much a mixed bag. So like we said before, it was kind of a cursed like storyline for Disney. It obviously was a project of passion as such. It's obviously, you know, Walt Disney at his best. It's really something which like meant a lot to him ever since he was a child, and he wanted to make this into a proper like feature-length film. But the problem is that it's kind of, it suffers from having too many chefs in the kitchen, right? So for instance, it has 14 writers compared to Cinderella, which just had 8. And on top of that, it's kind of, although it has a great casting, much better casting than Cinderella, there aren't really any like great songs in it. Visually speaking, there's nothing like that compelling. It's just yeah, it's not like that great of a film. So even at the time, the reaction wasn't that great, and it was a thing where it ended up costing $3 million to make, and at the domestic box office, it made just $2.4 million back. So when you compare it to Cinderella, like we said last week, which like cost almost, only cost about $2 million and yet made over $180 million. When you kind of see it like that, you go, oh, it's not really that great of a film in that kind of sense. And actually, a lot of the popularity for the film came out much later. So obviously, this came out in 1951. And again, like we said, the parents of children in the 1950s wanted them to be, there's no moral stories here. There's no kind of great moral teachings from Alice in Wonderland other than don't, what is there? Don't go down a rabbit hole because you might get lost. There's no good like moral like teachings and stuff, right? So it's not until the 1960s where there ends up being the kind of counterculture and the kind of like hippie movement where the film kind of end up having a kind of revamp, right? So the reason why Alice in Wonderland is such a kind of cultural kind of phenomenon is because in the 1960s, starting off with Jefferson Airplane in 1967 with the song White Rabbit. So within that, you have lyrics like, one pill makes you larger, another makes you small, etc., etc. So all of that is kind of a very clear reference to basically saying that like, oh, it's all like linked to drugs. And this is where people nowadays have the kind of misconception that the original story is linked to drugs and stuff, right? And psychedelics. It's not linked to that, but that's where the link of it comes from. And also as well, in terms of like the cultural impact and stuff, I should kind of say that when people talk about Alice in Wonderland, the image you get in your head is not the illustrations from the book. You don't even tend to really think about the book. People tend to think about this film here, right? This is the kind of classic one. So all the kind of like counterculture stuff that comes afterwards is all linked in with this, right? So that kind of explains the legacy of the film. And now talking about the kind of notable lines and the notable effects, we have like some notable lines. So we have this one.
He did?
He did what?
Went that way.
Who did?
The White Rabbit.
What rabbit?
But didn't you just say? Oh dear.
And we have this one.
The time has come.
And of course, we have this classic one, which is obviously the one that everyone remembers, which is... So this obviously like very like easily quotable. Like if you say like off of their head, almost everyone gets that reference, right? But again, other than these lines, there's not really much with regard to the film. So it's, in terms of notable effects, there aren't really any. Like visually speaking, it's not that competitive of a story. The content of what's on screen tends to be much more interesting than the actual quality of it. There's some scenes with regard to like, for instance, the flower scene and stuff, which I feel that like they must have had like the same animators who were in Fantasia. And also the story with the walrus, like we said, I reckon that because of the kind of parallels with like Honest John, I reckon that they had the same animators in Pinocchio as they had in that, right? So I'll check at the end of this, well, we'll be on screen now, whether I was correct in that estimation. Probably should have done research for that beforehand, but anyway, that's beside the point. Man does what he wants. But anyway, so now that we've kind of spoken about Alice in Wonderland, let me know in the comment section what you think about it, whether you were surprised about the kind of the origins of it, the kind of like darker things of it, whether you do think it actually, there was evidence that, if you find evidence that it was linked because of this and it had this and, please let me know in the comment section, right? But still, if that's not the case, you can obviously just leave a like and a comment and just say, I really liked the video and I want to see more things like this. Because if that's the case, obviously don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe if you haven't, hit the bell button. And next week we are going to be doing none other than Peter Pan. So that was the third film in terms of the three that were going through this race like in those days. And yeah, so without further ado, let's wrap this video up and have a great day and bye.